In the very back row of the classroom, tucked away by the window, there was a girl who seemed to be trying to make herself smaller. She wasn't just quiet. It was as if she had perfected the art of being invisible. Her shoulders were often hunched over her desk, creating a small, private fortress with her textbooks and notebooks. Her hair, which she often wore loose, would fall like a curtain around her face, a shield she could hide behind when she felt the eyes of others on her. While other students chatted and laughed before the bell, she would be found tracing the wood grain of the desk with her finger or reading a book that had nothing to do with the class. She was a constant presence, yet somehow not really there at all. She was just a background figure in the noisy, chaotic painting of high school life, the man at the front of the room. Her English teacher was the complete opposite. He commanded space with his loud voice and his sharp, pacing steps. He believed a good classroom was a loud one, a place of debate and argument where ideas were shouted and defended. He valued the quick-witted, the bold, the students who weren't afraid to be wrong. To him, silence wasn't a sign of thoughtfulness. It was a sign of emptiness. He saw the girl in the back not as someone who was introverted, but as someone who was lazy, disengaged, and probably not very bright. He had a knack for making his feelings known without ever saying a direct, cruel word. It was in the way his eyes would glide over her hand when it was raised, just for a moment before picking someone else. It was in the heavy, dramatic sigh he would let out when he had to call her name for attendance. As if it was a great personal effort, his favorite tactic was the pointed, public question. He would be in the middle of a lecture, perhaps about symbolism in some old novel, and he would stop mid-sentence. His eyes would scan the room, passing over all the eager faces until they landed on her, a tiny figure in the back. Perhaps someone who isn't daydreaming by the window can tell me what the author meant by that, he would say, his voice dripping with a kind of theatrical disappointment. The entire class would turn to look. A few kids would snicker quietly into their hands. The girl would feel a hot flush creep up her neck, her heart would start to beat a little faster, and she would wish, more than anything, that the floor would open up and swallow her whole. She usually knew the answer. She had read the book, thought about the symbols, and even formed her own opinions. But in that moment, under the weight of his stare and the curiosity of her classmates, the words would get stuck somewhere in her throat. All she could manage was a quiet, "I don't know," which was exactly what he wanted to hear. It confirmed his belief about her, and he would move on, satisfied, leaving her to shrink even further into her seat. What the teacher, and probably most of her classmates, didn't understand was that her world was not empty. It was full. It was just a world that existed inside her own head, a place filled with melodies and harmonies and rhythms. While he was talking about metaphors, she was often thinking about a chord progression she had been struggling with the night before. While her classmates were whispering about weekend plans, she was mentally composing a tune, fitting notes together like puzzle pieces. Her silence wasn't a void. It was a quiet, busy workshop of the mind. She had a voice, a powerful and expressive one, but it didn't live in her throat. It lived in her hands. The final bell was always her favorite sound of the day. It was a signal that she could finally pack up her fortress, escape the heavy air of the classroom, and breathe again. She would be one of the first ones out the door, not rushing, but moving with a sense of purpose, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She didn't wait for friends or linger at her locker. She walked the familiar road home, her footsteps falling into a steady rhythm on the pavement. With each block she put between herself and the school, she could feel the tension in her shoulders start to ease. The world outside was neutral. The trees didn't judge her, the cars driving by didn't care if she was quiet or loud. It was a relief. Her home was her sanctuary. It was a small, cozy house that always smelled like whatever her mother was cooking for dinner and the faint, dusty scent of old books. But the real heart of her sanctuary was in the living room, pushed up against the far wall. It was an old, upright piano. Its wood was scuffed and scratched from years of use, and some of the ivory keys were yellowed and slightly chipped. But to her, it was the most beautiful object in the world. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a trusted friend, a confidant, the one place where she never had to be afraid. After dropping her bag in her room, She would walk straight to the piano, lifting the fallboard to reveal the keys. She would sit on the worn wooden bench, the one that had a slight creak right in the middle, and just rest her fingers on the cool, smooth ivory for a moment. In the quiet of the house, with the late afternoon sun streaming through the window and lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air, she would take a deep breath, and then she would begin to play. It started softly, a simple melody that felt like a sigh of relief. Her fingers, which had been clenched into anxious fists under her desk all day, now moved with a grace and confidence that seemed to belong to a different person entirely. The notes that came out were not just sounds. They were words. They were the things she wanted to say in class but couldn't. They were her frustration, her joy, her sadness, her dreams. The quiet, invisible girl from the back row disappeared, and in her place was a musician, a storyteller, an artist with a voice that could fill the entire house and spill out into the garden, speaking a language far more powerful and true than anything her English teacher could ever understand. This was who she really was, and for these precious hours every day she was completely, unapologetically herself. The air in the classroom felt different as the week began to wind down. It was that special kind of restlessness that only comes right before a big break, a low hum of energy that made it hard for anyone, even the teacher, to keep things on track. He stood at the front of the room, tapping a thick stack of handouts on his desk to get everyone's attention. The sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the chatter. "All right, settle down," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority. "We have one last major piece of business before the semester ends." "Your final project?" A collective groan rippled through the room, followed by a few curious whispers. He ignored the noise and began to hand out the papers. "This will be a simple 5-minute presentation. The topic is my passion. I want each of you to get up here and share something you truly care about, something that makes you excited. It can be a hobby, a skill, a cause you believe in. I want you to teach us about it. Show us why it matters to you." As the papers made their way to the back row, the girl felt her chest tighten. A presentation on her passion. Her mind immediately went to the old upright piano at home, to the way her fingers felt on the keys, to the melodies that filled her quiet world. But the thought of trying to explain that to this room, to him, was like trying to capture a cloud in a jar. How could she possibly put that feeling into words? The other kids were already buzzing. The boy who played on the basketball team was already talking about doing a demonstration. The girl who loved to draw was planning a slideshow of her best artwork. Their passions were visible, easy to show and tell. Hers was invisible, a secret language of notes and emotions. "To make this interesting," the teacher continued, leaning against his desk with a slight smirk, "you all get to choose your presentation day. I'm putting a sign-up sheet here on my desk. First come, first served. We have 8 slots for this Friday and 8 for the next Monday. Don't be shy." The moment the bell rang, a small crowd swarmed his desk. Pens scribbled, filling up the prime slots. The early Friday spots were gone in seconds, taken by the confident kids who were already planning what they were going to wear. The girl hung back, waiting for the rush to die down. Her heart was beating a little too fast. She knew she should just go up there, pick a spot, and get it over with. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every time she thought about walking up there, she could feel the teacher's eyes on her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. Finally, the crowd thinned out. She took a deep breath and forced herself to walk forward. The sign-up sheet was almost full. Only a few spots remained, all on the dreaded last day, Monday afternoon. The final slot of the entire project, the very last one before the exam started. It was the worst possible time. Everyone would be tired, ready for the semester to be over. No one would want to listen. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly, and hovered it over the empty line. Just then, she felt a presence behind her. Having trouble deciding? It was him. He had come up silently behind her, his shadow falling over the desk. She flinched, dropping the pen with a small clatter. She quickly bent to pick it up, her face burning with embarrassment. "Don't be shy," he said, his voice a little too loud. He picked up the pen himself, a gesture that felt strangely controlling. Let's see here. All the good spots are taken. But we have the perfect spot left for you. He leaned in, and she could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. He wrote her name in the very last slot on the list, his handwriting large and neat. There, you have the honor of closing us out. The grand finale. He looked up from the paper and directly at her, a glint in his eye that she couldn't quite read. Let's hope you can give us something memorable to end the semester. We'll all be waiting. The way he said it, memorable, felt like a threat. It wasn't an encouragement. It was a challenge. He was setting her up. He was painting a target on her back, and the whole class would be there to watch. He wanted her to fail. He wanted her to stand up there, quiet and awkward, and prove him right. She gave a small, stiff nod and quickly walked back to her seat, not daring to look at anyone. She could feel a few pairs of eyes on her, and she heard a quiet snicker from somewhere in the middle of the room. The next few days were a special kind of torture. The dread she felt was a physical thing, a heavy stone in her stomach that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. At night, she would lie in bed, replaying the scene at the desk over and over again. She would imagine herself standing in front of the class, her mind completely blank, while the teacher stared at her with his arms crossed, a look of disappointment on his face. The thought made her stomach churn. She tried to think of an alternative. She could do something safe. She could talk about her favorite author. She loved books, and she could easily put together 5 minutes on why she liked a certain series. It would be boring, but it would be safe. It wouldn't be humiliating. But every time she considered it, she felt a pang of guilt. It would be a lie. Her real passion wasn't on that bookshelf. It was sitting in the living room, covered in a thin layer of dust to protect it. The contrast between her two worlds was never more clear. At home, she would sit at the piano, and the world would fall away. Her fingers would dance across the keys, and the music would pour out of her, full of all the things she couldn't say. It was her voice, strong and clear and beautiful. But the thought of bringing that voice into the classroom was terrifying. The classroom keyboard was a cheap, electric thing with plastic keys that felt nothing like the worn ivory of her piano. It sounded thin and reedy. How could she possibly create anything beautiful on it? She started to notice the other students getting ready. The basketball player brought in a ball to practice his dribbling. The artist was furiously drawing flashcards. Their excitement only made her feel more isolated. They were proud of their passions. They couldn't wait to share them. She, on the other hand, felt like she had a precious, fragile secret that she was being forced to reveal in the most hostile environment imaginable. The weekend felt like a countdown to her own execution. Every time the clock ticked, it felt like it was bringing her closer to that Monday afternoon, to that final, dreaded slot. The teacher's words echoed in her head, "We'll all be waiting." And she knew they would be. The final bell on Monday felt less like a release and more like the starting gun for a race she desperately didn't want to run. The weekend had been a blur of anxious energy, a constant loop of dread playing in her mind. She had barely touched the piano, the thought of it now tainted by the impending performance. It was like her one safe space had been invaded by the very place she feared most. Now, as she sat in her usual spot in the back, she felt like a prisoner on death row, watching the clock tick away the minutes of her life. The class was a sea of restless energy. The presentations had been going on all day, and they were exactly what everyone expected. The basketball player had stumbled through a nervous explanation of a three-point shot. The artist had shown some nice drawings, but spoke so quietly that half the class couldn't hear her. One by one, students went to the front, did their time, and returned to their seats to a smattering of polite, unenthusiastic applause. The teacher looked bored, leaning against his desk, occasionally checking his watch. He was just waiting for it all to be over, and then it was her turn. "All right," the teacher announced, his voice loud and sharp in the quiet room. "One last presentation to wrap things up. Let's have a good listen." He looked directly at her, and his expression was not one of encouragement, but of grim expectation. It was the look a person gives, When they are about to watch a car crash in slow motion, she felt her legs turn to lead as she stood up. Every eye in the room was on her. The walk to the front of the classroom felt like the longest journey of her life. The floorboards seemed to creak louder with each step she took, announcing her approach. She could feel a familiar hot flush creeping up her neck and her hands were clammy. She kept her eyes down, focused on the worn linoleum floor, just wanting it to be over. She reached the front of the room and stood for a moment in front of the podium, her notes clutched in her hand. She had prepared a safe, boring speech about a famous author, just in case she lost her nerve, but then something shifted inside her. She looked at the teacher, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed, a look of patient superiority on his face. She thought of all the little comments, all the pointed questions, all the times he had made her feel small and invisible. A tiny spark of defiance flickered in her chest. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her fail. She was not going to stand there and mumble through a lie. Instead of stepping up to the podium, she turned and walked to the far corner of the room. Tucked away beside a bookshelf was the classroom's old electric keyboard. It was a cheap, plastic thing covered in a fine layer of dust. It was usually only used for simple music theory exercises, and most students saw it as a joke. A few confused murmurs rippled through the class. The teacher raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity on his face. He gave a curt, almost dismissive nod, as if to say, "Go on, then. Make a fool of yourself." She pulled the small bench out and sat down. The plastic keys felt cold and unnatural under her fingers, nothing like the warm, responsive ivory of her piano at home. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for just a second, and tried to block everything out. The teacher, the students, the cheap keyboard, the fear. She pictured herself at home, in the quiet of her living room, with the late afternoon sun on her hands. She pictured the music. For a moment there was only silence. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. A few students started to shift in their seats, and someone let out a quiet cough. The teacher's posture was rigid, his arms still crossed. His foot tapping impatiently, and then she began to play. The first few notes were quiet, almost hesitant, like a question being asked into the silence. But the sound that came out of the cheap speakers was surprisingly rich, full of a sadness that everyone in the room could feel. It wasn't just a series of notes. It was a story. It was the feeling of being alone, of looking out a window and feeling invisible. The quiet side conversations in the room stopped one by one. A boy who was about to whisper something to his friend froze, his mouth hanging open. A girl who had been doodling in her notebook slowly put her pen down. Her eyes wide, the melody began to grow, to become more complex. It was like a quiet conversation that was slowly getting more passionate, more insistent. Her fingers, which had been trembling just moments before, now moved with a certainty and grace that seemed impossible. They danced across the plastic keys, coaxing a sound out of the instrument that no one knew it was capable of making. The music swelled, filling every corner of the drab classroom. It was no longer just sad. It was full of a longing, a deep and powerful ache for something more. Then the music shifted again. It grew stronger, more confident. It was like a storm gathering on the horizon, the notes becoming faster, more powerful, cascading down like a waterfall of sound. It was full of frustration and anger, but it was also beautiful. It was the sound of a voice that had been silenced for too long, finally screaming to be heard. Her body was swaying slightly with the rhythm, her eyes closed, completely lost in the world she was creating. She wasn't in the classroom anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere only the music could take her. The entire class was captivated. No one was looking at their phones. No one was whispering. They were all just staring at the quiet girl from the back row. This person they thought they knew, and realizing they had no idea who she was at all. The most stunning transformation, however, was happening at the front of the room. The teacher's arms had uncrossed and fallen to his sides. His foot had stopped tapping. His jaw was slack, and his eyes were wide with a look of complete and utter shock. He was staring at her as if he were seeing a ghost. The smug, superior look was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded disbelief. He had set a trap, a public stage for her humiliation. And she had not only disarmed it, but had turned it into something transcendent. The music reached its peak, a thunderstorm of emotion that was both overwhelming and beautiful. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it softened. The storm passed, and the melody became gentle again, but it was different now. It wasn't sad or lonely. It was peaceful, a sense of hard-won acceptance. It was the feeling of finding your voice after a long silence, of standing in the sun after a lifetime in the shadows. She played a final, soft chord and let the note hang in the air for a moment before it faded into silence. The final note hung in the air for what felt like a lifetime, a delicate, shimmering sound that slowly dissolved into the quiet hum of the classroom's fluorescent lights. And then there was silence. It wasn't the usual, awkward silence that follows a student's fumbled presentation. This was different. This was a heavy, profound silence that pressed down on everyone in the room, thick with an emotion that no one could quite name. It was the silence of a shared, breathtaking experience, a moment so powerful that words felt like an insult. For the girl at the keyboard, the world slowly came back into focus. Her fingers, which had been flying across the keys with a life of their own, were now still. She could feel the slight vibration of the plastic keys under her fingertips. She could hear her own breathing, soft and ragged in the quiet room. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, afraid of what she would see when she opened them. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was still safe, still lost in the world of the music. But out there, in the harsh light of the classroom, was judgment. She braced herself for the snickers, the polite, pitying applause. The teacher's dismissive comment that would cut her down to size once again, across the room. The students were frozen in their seats like a photograph. The boy who was always tapping his pen was perfectly still. The girls who usually passed notes had their hands hovering over their desks, forgotten. Every single person was staring at the slight figure hunched over the cheap keyboard in the corner. Their faces held a uniform expression of disbelief, their minds struggling to connect the quiet, invisible girl from the back row with the storm of passion and beauty that had just poured out of her. They were looking at a stranger, someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. But the most dramatic transformation was at the front of the room. The teacher, the man who controlled the very air they breathed with his loud voice and sharp opinions, was a statue. His arms, which had been crossed in a posture of smug authority, had fallen limply to his sides. His mouth, which was usually twisted into a smirk or a frown, was slightly agape. His eyes, which so often held a look of bored disappointment, were wide and vacant, staring at the girl as if she were an impossible apparition. The trap he had so carefully laid had not just been sprung. It had been completely obliterated, replaced by something he had no capacity to understand. He had been so sure of her failure, so confident in his power to define her, that her success had short-circuited his entire system. He was a man who had just discovered that the world was not at all what he thought it was. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. The girl finally opened her eyes. She saw the dusty blackboard, the posters on the wall, the clock on the wall whose second hand seemed to be frozen. She slowly lifted her head and looked out at the sea of faces. She expected to see mockery, boredom, or indifference. Instead, she saw awe. She saw wonder. She saw a room full of her peers looking at her not with pity, but with a newfound, undisguised respect. Then a single sound broke the spell. It was a sharp, distinct clap, coming from a quiet boy in the front row who rarely spoke to anyone. It was a sound of pure, unthinking appreciation. For a second it hung alone in the silence, a brave and solitary act. Then it was joined by another and another. A few students at the back started clapping too. The sound was hesitant at first, a scattered ripple of recognition, but then it began to build. It grew stronger, more confident, until it was no longer just clapping. It was a wave of sound, a roar of applause that filled the room, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause that followed most presentations. This was loud, genuine, and sustained. It was the kind of applause usually reserved for a concert hall, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. And then something even more surprising happened. A girl in the second row stood up, then another, and another. Within seconds, half the class was on their feet, their applause growing even louder. A standing ovation for the quiet girl who had found her voice. The girl at the keyboard just sat there, completely overwhelmed. She watched them standing and clapping for her, and her mind struggled to catch up. This was not the humiliation she had been bracing for. This was the exact opposite. It was a validation so profound it felt like a physical force. The hot flush of shame on her neck was replaced by a different kind of heat, a warmth that spread through her chest. The heavy stone of dread that had been in her stomach for a week was gone, and in its place was a light, fluttering feeling she had never experienced before. A small, uncertain smile touched her lips just then. The final bell rang, its shrill, jarring sound cutting through the applause like a knife. It was a sudden return to reality, a signal that the moment was over. But as the students began to gather their things, the atmosphere in the room was permanently changed. The usual chaotic rush for the door was absent. The movements were slower, more thoughtful. As the girl packed her own bag, her hands were steady for the first time all day. She stood up and started to walk down the aisle toward the door. The students parted for her, making a clear path. But this time, it wasn't out of indifference, as if she were just a piece of furniture they had to walk around. It was a gesture of respect. As she passed, a boy who had never spoken to her before looked her right in the eye and said, in a quiet, sincere voice, "That was incredible." She just nodded, not trusting her own voice. Another girl gave her a small, genuine smile. She reached the front of the room. The teacher was still standing by his desk, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the floor, his face a mask of confusion and grudging respect. He had no power here anymore. He had been defeated, not by an argument, but by an art form he couldn't begin to comprehend. She didn't wait for him to say anything. She just walked past him and out the door, leaving the sound of the fading applause and the stunned silence of her defeated teacher behind her. The weight of her invisibility was gone, replaced by the light, unfamiliar feeling of being truly seen. Walking out of that classroom felt like stepping into a different world. The hallway, which was usually a chaotic blur of shouting students and slamming lockers, seemed to move in slow motion. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead didn't feel as glaring. The usual weight on her shoulders, the one she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it, was gone. She felt light, almost buoyant, as if she could float down the corridor and out the front door. She kept her head down, not out of habit or fear, but because she was still processing what had just happened. The sound of the applause was still ringing in her ears, a warm, protective echo against the silence she was used to. The walk home was different, too. She didn't rush. She didn't feel the need to escape. She walked at a steady, measured pace, noticing things she had never noticed before. The way the late afternoon sun made the leaves on the trees glow a bright, vibrant green. The sound of a dog barking happily in a nearby yard. The smell of freshly cut grass. These simple, everyday things seemed sharper, more real. She realized that, for years, she had been walking through the world with her head down. Not just physically, but emotionally. She had been so focused on protecting herself, on making herself small, that she had missed out on the simple beauty of just existing. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was a part of it all, not just an observer watching from the sidelines. When she got home, she didn't go straight to the piano. She went to her room and sat on her bed, just looking out the window. She replayed the afternoon in her mind, not with the usual sense of dread and embarrassment, but with a strange, detached curiosity. She saw herself walking to the front of the room, felt the cold plastic of the keyboard, and heard the music filling the air. It was like watching a movie about someone else. But then she remembered the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way the music had flowed through her, and the look of shock on the teacher's face. A small smile crept onto her lips, a real, genuine smile that she didn't have to force. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction, of a battle won without ever throwing a punch. The next morning at school was the true test. As she walked down the crowded hallway, She braced herself for the usual routine of being invisible, of people bumping into her without a second glance. But that's not what happened. As she passed a group of girls by the lockers, one of them looked up and gave her a small, friendly smile. A boy who was walking in the opposite direction actually stepped aside to let her pass, nodding at her in a gesture of respect. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but to her it was a seismic shift. The world was seeing her dot in English class. The change was even more pronounced. As she walked toward her usual seat in the back, a girl who sat a few rows ahead waved her over. "Hey," the girl said, gesturing to the empty seat next to her. "You can sit here if you want." The girl was stunned for a moment, her feet frozen to the floor. She had never been invited to sit with anyone before. She gave a hesitant nod and slid into the seat, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. The girl didn't ask her about the piano right away. She just started talking about her weekend, a normal, everyday conversation, as if they had been friends for years. It was disorienting, but in a good way. When the teacher walked in, the atmosphere in the room changed. He didn't have his usual loud, commanding presence. He seemed quieter, almost subdued. He placed his briefcase on his desk and took out his papers, avoiding looking in her direction. When he did the morning roll call, he said her name in a flat, neutral tone, without the usual dramatic sigh or pause. It was as if he was afraid of her, as if her talent was a power he didn't understand and therefore couldn't control throughout the class. He never once called on her, even when her hand was raised. It wasn't a malicious ignoring like before. It was a careful, deliberate avoidance. He was treating her like a fragile, explosive device that might go off if he handled it incorrectly. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that he, the ultimate authority figure in the room, was now the one who was unsure and uncomfortable. She had not said a single word to him, but she had said more than enough. At lunch, she didn't sit by herself in the corner, reading a book. The girl from English class found her and led her over to a table in the middle of the bustling cafeteria. "Sit with us," she said, and it wasn't a question. She was introduced to a few other people. They talked about a new movie that was out, complained about a difficult math test, and laughed about a funny video they had seen online. She didn't say much, just listened and smiled, but for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. She was a part of the conversation, even in her silence. It was a different kind of quiet, a comfortable one, filled with the warmth of friendship instead of the cold chill of loneliness. That afternoon, when she got home, she went straight to the piano. She lifted the fallboard and sat on the familiar, creaky bench. She placed her fingers on the keys, but she didn't play the same sad, longing melodies she usually did. She played something new. It was a simple, hopeful tune, full of light and air. It was the sound of a door opening, of a window being thrown wide to let in the sun. The piano was no longer just her escape, her secret world. It was her bridge to the outside world, the key that had unlocked a door she hadn't even known was there. She had found her voice, and it was a voice that didn't need words. It was a voice that spoke directly to the heart. A voice that had turned a classroom of critics into an audience of admirers, and a teacher who thought he knew everything into a man who had been humbled by a quiet girl with a powerful song to sing.